approached her, sat in front of her, rested his hand on the ground, started looking into her eyes and called her by her name. The girl opened her eyes and they filled with surprise. She was somewhat confused and did not know how Vikir knew her name. Several seconds passed and she did not respond, and seeing this, Vikir began to show a kind smile, and with a cheerful look asked if Perry was her name. Upon feeling Vikir's gaze and smile, the girl's eyes filled with astonishment. She knew that she could trust him. But far from responding, she turned her back on him and without hesitating for a second, ran away, leaving poor Vikir somewhat confused. He began to observe her and couldn't help but wonder if he looked that bad when he smiled. While he was distracted, someone wearing white clothing started walking towards him saying that she didn't believe the girl had run because she hated him. She was none other than Saintess Dollars. With a cheerful look, she revealed that she had seen everything. Her eyes filled with surprise and she couldn't help but smile. She didn't know why he was grotesque, but now she realized that our boy was quite kind. Vikir stood up and with a calm look asked what President Dollars was doing here. She approached him, placed her hands on her abdomen, and with a sincere look revealed that Perry's heart had been hurt before, so for this reason she had closed it off. As a result, she developed aphasia and lost her voice. Vikir turned to her and with a curious look asked what had happened to her. Dollars began to look down and with a sad expression mentioned that she didn't know the exact details, but she had been born in the orphanage, and in the last 13 years she had met countless volunteers who had passed through here. In front of them, there was a dark hallway and Dollars explained that at first, everyone had approached her in a friendly manner. But after one day, they stopped coming due to their busy schedules, so she assumed that Perry must be tired of attaching to someone in a short period of time and then mourning their disappearance for a long time. Vikir began to look at Perry with a sad expression and fell silent. At that moment, the previously dark hallway filled with footsteps. Someone wearing boots started to walk. Upon sensing this presence, Vikir's eyes filled with fear causing him to start sweating like crazy. While he was distracted, Dollars put her hand on her chest and with a happy look explained that Perry had reacted very well to him. She assumed that she was going to be fine with him, so she asked him if he could take care of Perry. At that moment, Vikir put his hand over her mouth so that she would stop talking, causing her eyes to fill with confusion. She couldn't help but panic since she didn't know what was happening. Two men started walking down the hallway. The man in the green suit turned his head towards the other and mentioned that he was so busy that they rarely got to see each other. The other man simply started to walk in silence. He was none other than Dantalion, or better known as the headmaster Quilty. While he had his hands behind his back, he closed his eyes and with a smile explained that there had recently been a sudden increase in the number of people who had requested face-to-face talks to confess their sins. Behind him was his subordinate, Ephibo, who now had the face of a human. The man wearing a green suit said that for this reason he also needed to buy the exemption. Quilty opened his eyes, began to observe him and with a calm look asked how long he needed it for. Vikir covered Dollars' mouth with his hand, and took her hand with the other hand and leaned back against the pillar to avoid being discovered. While Ephibo was walking behind them, the man and Quilty who were walking ahead started to converse with each other. The man wanted to buy 1 billion worth in gold. Quilty asked if he had recently killed someone, to which he replied that he had killed a barbarian slave that he had bought not long ago who had escaped, and on the way back to capture him, he had been disciplining him but unfortunately the barbarian died. Quilty was left somewhat confused and asked if he was buying 1 billion in exemption just for having killed a slave. But the man revealed that on the way back, as he was still angry, he had burned an entire village of slash and burn farmers. Vikir turned his head towards them and quietly asked her to please be silent. Dollars' eyes filled with surprise as she did not know why he was doing this suddenly. Vikir began to feel a strong smell and his eyes filled with rage, and started to shine. Quilty and the man who were conversing among themselves began to move away from them, and the smell that Vikir was feeling came from Quilty. Quilty, who had his hands behind his back, said that 500 million was fine for something like this. The man extended his hand forward and decided to give the other half as a tip to God, who was forgiving his sins. The smell that Quilty's body was giving off was the same as that of the elite corpses. Seeing that the man wanted to give a tip to God, Quilty couldn't help but smile with joy and think that it was sacrilegious, explaining that giving offerings to God would make God forgive everything. Upon hearing this, Dollars couldn't help but go into shock and her eyes filled with surprise. She didn't know what was happening here. The man started to laugh since he felt that he was always learning about faith from him. Quilty, who had his eyes closed and arms behind his back, could not help but smile even more, thinking that he was too kind. Dollars began to lose her composure and could not help but get angry. She wanted to give Quilty a good lesson, but Vikir forcefully covered her mouth to prevent her from making noise. Vikir asked her to wait since if she made a move now, they were going to be discovered. Dolores started moving her feet asking Vikir to let her go. At that moment, upon hearing the noise, Ephibo appeared and with a penetrating look began staring at them. Upon feeling the presence of Ephibo, Vikir, who was covering her mouth with his hand, panicked and his eyes filled with fear. He knew that this was not good, while on the other side, Dolores remained silent as she did not know what was happening nor who this guy was. Upon feeling a strange presence, Vikir and Dolores looked to one side and saw Ephibo standing next to them staring at them intently. Dolores' eyes filled with confusion as she did not know who this guy was. Meanwhile, on the other side, Vikir went on alert and realized that they had been discovered. Several seconds passed and nothing happened. Vikir began to stare intently at Ephibo and noticed something strange. While Ephibo was staring intensely at Vikir and Dolores, our boy realized that this guy emitted a rather familiar smell. Now that Dantalion had modified Ephibo's face to have the same one as a human, Vikir could not discover his true identity for now. Upon seeing that Ephibo had stopped, Dantalion, who had his hands behind his back, turned around, closed his eyes and couldn't help but smile since he did not expect to find the Saintess here. He was somewhat disappointed as he did not know she had the bad habit of eavesdropping on others' conversations. The rich man with whom Dantalion was conversing placed his hands over his abdomen and remained silent without interrupting. Upon hearing this, the Saintess's eyes filled with surprise, while on the other side, Vikir, who knew that this bastard was a demon, began to gaze at the ground and started to think in silence. Seeing that she was with Vikir, Dantalion asked if she was having a secret romance with a classmate. Dolores became somewhat nervous, turned around, placed her hands over her abdomen and with a nervous look explained that this was a misunderstanding. Vikir, who was next to her, also turned around and began to observe Dantalion in silence. The eyes of the Saintess filled with concern. This ambiguous situation had made her be discovered eavesdropping. Dantalion approached Vikir, began to look him in the eyes and with a smile realized that judging by the academy uniform, he seemed like someone who had come to volunteer at the orphanage. With a firm gaze, Vikir returned the look to the demon, creating tension in the atmosphere. Dantalion's eyes began to shine, emitting a demonic aura. An exciting smile appeared on his face. He hadn't noticed because Vikir's face was covered by glasses, but looking closely, he had quite a handsome face. This made Dantalion excited since he liked collecting the faces of his victims. The face of Vikir was at the upper level of his collection. He wanted to have it. Vikir began to stare intently at Dantalion with a serene look and remained silent, holding back his internal hatred towards him. At that moment, the man who was conversing with Dantalion brought his fist close to his mouth, closed his eyes and coughed, indicating that it was time to continue with the conversation. Upon hearing his voice, Dantalion, who had one eye closed, came out of his trance, began to observe the man with the other one, and with a smile apologized for having kept him waiting. The man turned his back on him and began to walk away. Dantalion started to turn around, extended his hand towards them and with a kind smile explained to the Saintess that he was going to leave since today he was busy. Upon hearing this, Ephibo turned his back on Vikir and Dolores and began to walk towards them. Vikir and Dolores simply started to observe them and remained silent. Once they had moved away a little, Vikir clenched his fists, and his gaze fixed on Ephibo, who had a rather strange and familiar smell. Dolores clenched her teeth tightly due to frustration. She began to look at the ground and thought about corruption. Even after seeing him shamelessly sell indulgences, she couldn't say anything. Even after hearing blasphemous words against God, she turned to Vikir, extended her hand to one side, got angry and asked him why he had done this. Vikir turned towards her and remained silent. The reality was that he felt an uncontrollable inner fury. Several seconds passed and he did not respond. Seeing the fury in Vikir's eyes, Dolores was somewhat surprised and speechless. She did not know what was happening. Vikir began to look at the ground and with a sincere expression apologized to her for his behavior, explaining that from now on he would be more careful. After saying this, he turned his back on her and while walking away explained that he had been gone for a long time, so he had to return to the orphanage. While the sunlight was illuminating the area, Dolores began to observe Vikir and remained thinking in silence. Dolores' eyes were filled with surprise and confusion. While Vikir was moving away from her, many questions came to her mind. She did not know why Vikir seemed angry. Quilty Rune Indulgentia had an average stay time in the orphanage of approximately 2 hours per day. His main task was to sell indulgences to nobles and merchants. One day, like any other, a noble came to the orphanage and after talking with him, he handed over a box. Quilty took the box and began to show a kind smile. Occasionally he also sent by letter investment reports or sales accounting books of indulgences to the Quo Vadis family. He sent these letters through a white dove. Vikir killed the dove, and after checking the mail, it was confirmed that the recipient was Cardinal Humbert Rune Quo Vadia, head of the Quo Vadis family. He also noticed that Quilty was always accompanied by someone when he engaged in external activities. The rotation was of 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. Vikir began to imagine a Phoebo when he wore a mask and when he did not wear it. The mask that one of the guards had found during the explosion of the orphanage had been confirmed by smell to be from the same person who was called a Phoebo. Back to the present, Vikir lowered his head and with a lost look began to stare at the ground. It was expected that the remaining 3 people would be at an advanced graduate level or higher, just like a Phoebo. It was a high risk for our boy to take on 4 advanced graduates along with one of the 10 elite corpses. In conclusion, to eliminate Quilty, first it was necessary to deal with the 4 guards. Sancho, Tudor and Piggy arrived in the area and could not help but be left speechless and confused at the same time upon witnessing what was happening before their eyes. Before them was Vikir, who was washing clothes with a wooden board using water from the river. Next to him there was a large basket with dirty laundry. Seeing this, Tudor, Sancho and Piggy could not help but feel somewhat surprised and asked why he was working so hard. Sancho crossed his arms, closed his eyes and felt embarrassed for trying to earn points by completing hours of volunteering. Tudor clenched his fist, and his gaze filled with determination. He couldn't believe that Vikir was doing all this to help the children. He decided to follow his example and work harder to become a true hero. Piggy began to observe Vikir and fell silent. Several seconds later, the 3 raised their fists and decided to follow him. Upon hearing their voices, Vikir, who was washing clothes by hand, turned towards them and was somewhat surprised. Vikir began to clean his cheek with his hand, and with a lost look he began to gaze at the ground. He was so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't even noticed that his friends had come. It was difficult to act during the day. He had to wait for night to arrive. For now he decided to concentrate on the day. Today it was a wonderful day, and the sky was clear. After a few hours someone threw the run-flat ball into the air. The ball had been thrown by the children of the orphanage who were happily playing run-flat. With a smile one of the children extended his hands to catch the ball, while being followed by the others. In the area there was a tree. While all the children were playing, a girl sat next to the tree and began to watch the game in silence. This child was none other than Perry. Several minutes passed, and instead of going to play with the children, she stayed watching. At that moment, she turned her head to one side and her eyes filled with surprise. Someone wearing academy boots sat next to her and threw a ball on the ground, which bounced against it and flew away. This person was none other than Vikir. He sat on the tree next to her, and while he had one hand resting on his knee, he began to bounce the ball with the other. Perry started to look at Vikir and remained thinking in silence. She did not know what he was trying to do. Vikir kept bouncing the ball, and this awakened Perry's curiosity. Her eyes filled with curiosity and her gaze fixed on the ball. Seeing this, Vikir could not help but smile and with a cheerful look remembered that the children of Balak also liked to play with this ball. He picked up the ball, and the reality was that it was not a ball, but the madam's egg. It had not shown signs of hatching, and the grip was not bad. Vikir always carried the egg with him just in case, but he had never thought he would use it for something like this. Vikir threw the ball again, and curiosity in Perry's eyes increased dramatically. She was stunned to see how well this ball bounced. Her gaze fixed on the ball and her desire to play with it grew stronger. She tried to hold back but was unable. Several seconds later, she picked up the ball and with a pleasant and excited smile, she prepared to bounce it. She began to happily bounce the ball, and Vikir, who had his hand over his mouth, started to watch her and couldn't help but smile upon seeing that his plan had worked. Behind them were some stairs on which Sinclair was sitting. While she had one hand resting on her knees, she rested her head on the other hand, closed her eyes, and couldn't help but smile since, as expected, Vikir was kind. Upon hearing her voice, Vikir came out of his trance, broke his hand from his mouth and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. When he turned around, he saw Sinclair. She began to blush and with a happy look, mentioned that he had a somewhat blunt side. Vikir didn't even look at her, turned his head to the side and asked what she wanted. She stood up, put her hands behind her back and started walking towards him, explaining that the reason was obvious. She approached Vikir, closed her eyes and with a pleasant smile revealed that she simply wanted them to be friends. She was a year younger than Vikir, and if he didn't mind then she could talk to him formally. Vikir started looking straight ahead and remained thinking in silence. Then he turned his head back and with a calm look gave her the order to do what she wanted. Upon hearing this, a smile appeared on her face, causing her to start blushing. While Perry was happily playing with the ball, Sinclair got even closer to Vikir and realized that she could be more informal, calling Vikir brother. Vikir replied that he felt a little uncomfortable being called brother. She decided to think of another way to call him until the next time they met. While they were conversing, Perry continued happily playing with the ball. She threw the ball again. But at that moment, it began to move in the air, leaving little Perry somewhat confused. At that moment, the ball bounced forward. And seeing this, Perry's eyes filled with concern and she started to follow the ball. In the grid that was next to the estuary canal, there was a small hole. Unfortunately, the ball went through the hole and fell into the water. Upon hearing the sound of water, Vikir's and Sinclair's attention shifted towards little Perry. Both were somewhat surprised. Both approached the grid where Perry was. Sinclair put her hands on her knees, bent down a bit and explained that the ball had gone to the estuary, so there was nothing they could do about it. Little Perry put her hands close to her mouth and her eyes filled with worry. Upon hearing that they could not retrieve the ball, Perry's eyes filled with tears. She began to look at Vikir hoping that he could do something about it. With a serious look, Vikir asked her not to worry since it was just a ball. With a sad look, Perry began to look down and started to cry. Vikir began to observe her and started to think. With a smile, he began to unbutton his academy uniform. He couldn't help it. He wanted to make little Perry happy. At the same time, someone wearing white boots began to walk through the area. This person was none other than Dolores. She grabbed her elbow with her hand, closed her eyes and sighed, as she was still upset about it. Several seconds later, she opened her eyes and with a lost look began to think about Vikir. She started to remember the conversation about the night hound that they had had at the club. She had not had a good impression of him because he was judging someone with prejudice. Moreover, his behavior was so bad that he even received negative points to the point where he needed to do volunteer work. But the feelings about him were changing. A few hours ago, at the orphanage she met Tudor, who was carrying a child on his back. He extended his hand to one side and with a smile explained that the kitchen needed more hands. So Vikir had offered to go there first. She went to the kitchen where she found Tudor who was dressed like a cook, while he was holding a ladle in his hand. With a kind smile he explained that they had been distributing food until just now, and hot water wasn't coming out, so Vikir had gone to check the pipes. He hadn't even been able to eat because he had been busy giving out food. She went to the pipe room where she found Piggy. He had a towel around his neck. Upon seeing the president, Piggy became happy and explained that Vikir had gone to do laundry not long ago. Vikir had been able to fix the pipes recently so now they could boil the laundry. After this, she went to the laundry where she met Bianca. With a calm look she mentioned that Vikir had been hanging the clothes next to her until now. But the children had asked him to play, so he had gone to prepare the gym. Back in the present, Dolores started looking down with an insecure look. Everyone thought that Vikir was a good person. She had thought that her judgment of him was not accurate. But in reality she could not be more wrong. She actually had her own prejudices about him. As the sun was lighting up the area, she left the orphanage and approached some stairs. She put her hand behind her head and remembered that many were aware of the fact that Quilty and she did not have good relations. So if Vikir had been considerate by hiding with her because he had noticed Quilty, then she should apologize. Several seconds later, she saw Vikir, Sinclair, and little Perry standing in front of the estuary grate. She began to observe Vikir and her eyes filled with confusion as she did not know what was happening. Vikir started to take off his shirt. Sinclair put her hands over her eyes, but still continued looking and she couldn't help but start blushing. Perry, who was next to her and had her hands over her chest, began to cry as she wanted to get her ball back. Vikir took off the academy uniform and the boots and left them on the ground. After doing this, he gained momentum and made a big jump over the grate and threw himself into the dirty water of the estuary. Upon seeing this, both Sinclair, Dolores, and Perry were surprised and open-mouthed at the same time. A while later, Vikir pulled out the ball from the estuary, which was covered in dirty water. While he was holding the ball with his hand, he started to observe it and told Perry that he had found it. Now his whole body was also covered in dirty water. He turned his head back, started to look at Perry and with a smile explained that she no longer had to feel bad. Sinclair put her hand over her mouth, and her eyes filled with surprise, causing her to start blushing like a tomato. Upon seeing Vikir's body, Dolores couldn't help but start to blush. She was speechless as she couldn't believe that Vikir had jumped into the estuary to find the ball for Perry. Seeing that Vikir had found the ball, Perry was shocked and couldn't help but feel an inner peace. No one had ever done something like this for her before. After a few days on a sunny day, Tudor, Sancho, and Piggy also finished the tasks and went out to the yard to play with the children. Everyone was very happy. A little while later, Tutor, who was wiping the sweat from his forehead with his hand, started to look at the children and with a smile mentioned that today was the last day of volunteering. Sancho, who had one hand on his waist, began to smile and with a cheerful look replied that time had passed very quickly. Meanwhile, on the other side, Piggy, who was very tired and panting heavily, remained silent. Tutor clenched his fist, raised it to the sky, and decided to play until he ran out of energy. Next to them was the tree where Vikir was sitting. He intertwined his hands and remained thinking in silence. Next to him sat Perry. While the sun was illuminating the area, Vikir began to gaze at the ground with a lost look. Perry, who was sitting next to him, was holding something made of flowers. Her gaze was filled with sadness as today was our boy's last day of volunteering. Perry was red and sad at the same time. She lifted her head and started observing Vikir in silence. Vikir raised his head and with a serious look began to think of some way to kill that bastard Dantalian. While he was distracted, Perry approached him and without making a sound, she placed the flower crown on Vikir's head. Upon feeling this, he came out of his thoughts and couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. He started to touch his head with his hand, and with a confused look asked if this was a crown. Upon hearing this, Perry panicked, began to sweat, and with a surprised look started to shake her hands in denial. She approached him and took his hand. Upon feeling this, Vikir became even more confused as he didn't know what she wanted to do. She took our boy's hand with one hand and using the finger of the other began to write on the palm of his hand, thanking him for everything. Vikir started to observe her, and his eyes filled with surprise. Today was a wonderful day. Perry thanked our boy for always being with her and for finding the ball. Vikir replied that it was not necessary to thank him since he simply enjoyed doing it. At that moment, Perry moved her hand away and started thinking for several seconds. Then she wrote again on the palm of our boy's hand with her finger. After doing this, she moved her hands away, brought them close to her chest and with a sad look asked if they were going to see each other again someday. Vikir's gaze also filled with sadness. He began to remember what Dolores had told him about her. A few days ago, when Vikir ran into her, she started touching her cheek with her finger and with a sincere expression explained that at first everyone was friendly with her. But after a few days everyone was so busy that they couldn't even come to see her. She was tired of the temporary affection and the long separations. Perry sat back down, rested her hands on her abdomen and began to look at the ground with a gaze full of sadness. While our boy was hunting demons, he had to be prepared for death at all times. He could not promise that he would return. But still he answered that they were going to see each other again. Upon hearing this, Perry lifted her head and her eyes filled with happiness. While the wind was blowing the leaves, with a sincere look, Vikir promised that as long as there was a tomorrow for him, he would come here. Perry began to watch him and fell silent. She couldn't believe that Vikir had promised her this. She closed her eyes and started to show a happy smile. Thanking our boy, she decided to wait for that day eagerly. After this, both remained contemplating the views in silence for several minutes. Several hours later, in the main auditorium of the Indigentsia orphanage, all the students who had come to volunteer gathered together. Among them were Sancho, Piggy, Tutor and Bianca. Someone thanked everyone since for the children who had been separated from their parents and lived in the orphanage this was priceless. By knowing them, the children had felt their parents' presence and had been able to fill the void they had in their hearts. These words made everyone start to cry. The person who was thanking them was Quilty. He extended his hands to the sides, closed his eyes and with a smile explained that if the children grew up well it would be thanks to the wonderful volunteers. At that moment, a worker who was pushing a box of donations appeared and began to approach them. Quilty extended his hand towards the box and with a kind smile asked them to share with the children the love they had felt for them over the last 10 days. Upon hearing this, Piggy put his hands over his eyes and began to cry even more out of sadness. Next to him was Vikir, whose eyes filled with surprise upon seeing that Quilty had attended. Vikir started to touch his glasses and thought that this bastard was good at giving thanks with the tongue of the devil, appropriately subtly stimulating respect and a sense of debt towards the parents. He knew they were planning for the young students to donate to the orphanage. Next to Quilty were his 4 subordinates, who now had human faces. They simply remained silent. Quilty began to show a kind smile. Now that the 4 were here, it was going to be complicated to carry out an incursion. Vikir started to stare intently at Quilty with a penetrating look and decided not to let this guy do whatever he wanted. With a smile, Quilty began to persuade the students to donate to the orphanage. All preparations had been completed and today Vikir was going to hunt one of the 10 elite corpses as planned. Quilty's persuasion plan worked as the students began donating gold coins. A long line formed in front of the donation box. Everyone was happy to donate, even Piggy, Tutor, Bianca, and Sancho. Vikir did not get in line, and upon seeing this, Sinclair approached him, called him brother, put her hand over her mouth, and with a confused look she asked if he was not going to donate, to which he replied that he had no money. She was somewhat surprised and asked why he had no money, being a student of the academy. The real reason behind this was that he did not want to give money to a demon. Vikir began to observe the others and with a calm expression asked why she was calling him brother. She approached him and with a smile reminded him that he had said that she had to call him something else. According to her, it was too cold not to donate money since they were rich, so they should help the children of the orphanage even if it was just a little. Vikir started staring at Quilty and explained that there was no need for parents since anyway, the world was a place where one had to overcome it on their own. Parents were only necessary during childhood when the help of others was essential, and apart from that, according to our boy, they were not needed. Upon hearing this, Sinclair's gaze filled with concern. She began to look at Vikir and fell silent. She took Vikir's hand with both hands and with a sincere look realized that he had been through a very difficult time. Feeling this, Vikir's eyes filled with confusion as he did not know what she was doing. With a tender look, she took Vikir's hand and asked him to come visit her house later to eat together with her family during the holidays or vacations. After saying this, she turned her back to him and ran away, saying that for today she was done, with the excuse that she was going to see the children, asking him to make sure to take time after his volunteer work. Vikir began to look at her and remained thinking in silence. He brought his hand close to his face, started observing it, and with a perplexed look thought that she was a very strange person. Sinclair approached the children and with a kind smile began to pet their heads with her hand. Vikir realized that the identity she had sent to the academy was false. Before his regression, she had been the top genius of the class and had never lost first place in written and practical exams during 4 years, but for some reason, she disappeared as soon as after graduating, and the reason was never revealed to the world. All the children began to approach the students with happiness to give them a hug. Quilty, who was on the first floor, extended his hands to the sides and mentioned that from now on, they were going to take the time to thank the parents who had been with their children for the last 10 days. Tutor hugged a child, closed his eyes and started crying out of sadness, and swore to visit him every week until the day he became a great hero, and of course he was going to keep doing it after that. Sancho bent down, rested a hand on a child's shoulder, started stroking his head, and with a sincere look mentioned that in the north, the children, the young people who were going to lead the future, were the most beloved, saying that the future of the empire depended on him, asking him to work hard. 3 children approached Piggy. He extended his hands towards them and began to cry, promising that he was going to come back and was going to bring a lot of delicious food next time. Bianca started to stroke the head of a girl who was crying, and her eyes also filled with tears. For her, the 10 days had finally passed very quickly. She had become very attached to this girl. While everyone was saying goodbye to the children, Vikir stayed watching in silence. With a curious look, he began to look one way, and then the other. In front of him was Dolores, who was stroking the heads of 2 children. Vikir approached her and called her attention, and upon hearing his voice, her eyes filled with surprise. She did not know what was happening. She turned her head back and began to blush at the thought of Vikir. She started to remember Vikir when he had taken the ball out of the estuary. She did not know why this image kept coming to her mind. With a serene look, Vikir said that he had a question. He began to observe her and asked if she had seen Perry. She started looking at Vikir and remained thinking in silence. She put her hand on her cheek, looked away and replied that she could not see Perry around the area. For her this was strange since she had seen her that morning. Upon knowing this, Vikir's eyes filled with alertness and rage. He knew something bad had happened. Seeing that even she did not know, Vikir turned his back to her and as he was walking away said that he had to go. Dolores reached out to him and could not help but feel somewhat confused. Vikir began to remember Perry's happy smile and could not help but wonder why she had not appeared. His eyes were filled with rage. He stopped walking and turned his head back and his gaze fixed on Quilty. Quilty began to stare at Vikir and started to show a smile. Seeing his expression, Vikir realized that this bastard was responsible for Perry's disappearance. After a few hours, night fell and the sky filled with clouds which began to cover the moon. At the same time, in the room for the volunteer work, Sancho and Tutor were sleeping like a log on wooden beds. Tutor was dreaming of the orphanage. He did not want to leave here. Next to them there was another bed. The person who was sleeping in it took off the sheet and got up. At the same time, in the 4th building of the orphanage Indulgentia known as the children's dormitory, Quilty's subordinates arrived, all carrying weapons and ready to act. Without making a sound, the 4 began to walk, taking different paths. The dorm had 4 hallways, and the 4 took one hallway and started to walk. Several seconds later, Ephibo moved quite far from the area. It was night and the hallway behind him was very dark. Ephibo remained silent. And at that moment, Vikir, who wore the Night Hound mask, appeared from among the darkness and began to stare intently at Ephibo, who was distracted. He did not take long to feel Vikir's presence and quickly turned around. But to his surprise, Vikir disappeared. Ephibo's eyes filled with alertness. He knew that someone was following him. When he turned to the front, there was Vikir. With a penetrating look, he said that he had a question. Upon seeing him, Ephibo couldn't help but be somewhat surprised since he didn't know what was happening. Vikir asked where the children were who were locked up for the purpose of being the food supply for the demon. Upon hearing this, Ephibo drew his mace and prepared to attack. He knew that this was not good at all. Using all his strength, he swung the mace forcefully towards Vikir. As little by little the attack was getting closer, Vikir began to stare intently at Ephibo and fell silent. Just before he could make another move, Vikir moved at inhuman speed, and in the blink of an eye, cut off Ephibo's head. Vikir grabbed Ephibo's lifeless head by the hair and realized that this bastard could not speak. Vikir unsheathed the sword Beelzebub, causing the blade to begin to emit a demonic energy. He started to observe the blade, and upon seeing that this bastard did not want to talk, he decided not to waste any more of his time playing with him. While Ephibo's lifeless body lay on the ground behind him, Vikir grabbed his head by the hair and stood silently thinking. At that moment, Vikir began to look down, and his eyes filled with confusion as something caught his attention. Ephibo's face started emitting smoke and slowly began to melt, but even so, Vikir did not let go of the head. As Vikir was holding onto the hair of the face, Ephibo's real head emerged from the disguise, fell to the ground, and started rolling. Our boy simply stood there in silence, trying to understand the situation. Once Vikir looked at his hand, he saw that it was not his face but the mask that Ephibo was wearing. He began to observe the mask, and after analyzing it, he realized that this bastard had disguised himself as a human with a fake face. Vikir tightly grabbed the mask and his attention focused on Ephibo's head. He started staring at it intently, and Ephibo's real face was disfigured. He was missing an eye and half of his face had no skin. Upon looking more closely, Vikir realized that this was Peter's face, but when he examined further, he saw that there was a mole under the eye. He dismissed this theory since Peter did not have this mole. Before regressing, Vikir and Peter went to the jungle, and in the middle of the night they lit a bonfire and began to happily converse with each other. Back then, Peter often talked about his missing younger brother. He had disappeared after going into isolation training. But now Vikir knew the real reason. He hadn't disappeared because of isolation training, but because a demon had chased him and turned him into an undead. Vikir raised his head, and his gaze filled with seriousness as something was approaching. He was in a dark hallway, and beside him lay Ephibo's corpse. From the darkness emerged Heave, who unsheathed her scissors, and Fido, who unsheathed his swords. Both began walking slowly toward our boy. He turned towards them, started observing them, and it didn't take long for him to realize that they could be people he knew. Heave, who had the blade of the scissors resting on his shoulder, and Fido, who was behind him, began staring intently at Vikir and remained silent. Several seconds later, with a piercing gaze, they adopted an offensive stance, indicating that they were ready to attack. Upon seeing this, Vikir decided not to stand idly by. He drew the Beelzebub sword and began to run quickly towards the demons. This was something they did not expect, and upon seeing that he was ready to attack, both changed their stance and adopted a defensive pose. Vikir extended the sword backward, causing the blade to start emitting a powerful red energy, and our boy's eyes filled with rage. He wanted to kill these bastards at all costs in order to finally end the life of the demon Dantalion. Vikir approached them, and using all his power, launched a powerful slash. But luckily for them, the demons jumped away, dodging the attack at the last second. Now that our boy was defenseless due to the attack, the demons decided not to waste this opportunity. Fido appeared above and began approaching Vikir, preparing to strike, while on the other side, Heave appeared on the ground and prepared to swing the scissors with force. Luckily, Vikir turned around just in time, and upon seeing that they were ready to attack, he realized this wasn't good. The demons launched a powerful attack, creating a large smoke screen and making a lot of noise in the middle of the night. At the same time, somewhere else, there was a statue of a goddess praying. This scene was beautiful, as there was a hole in the ceiling and the moon was illuminating the area. Near the statue stood a blonde-haired woman who clasped her hands together and addressed the woman in the statue as Loon. This woman was none other than Dolores. She had come to this place to pray while the moonlight illuminated the area. She began to pray and asked Loon, who resided in the heavens, to forgive them for their sins just as they forgave those who sinned against them. While she was praying, the image of Vikir holding the ball and covered in water from the estuary appeared in her mind. She tried to stop thinking about this, but Vikir's figure became even larger. She clasped both hands tightly, brought them close to her face, closed her eyes and began blushing like a tomato, and asked Floon not to let them fall into temptation and deliver them from evil. But instead of disappearing, the image of Vikir became visible in her mind. She put her hands over her face and while red as a tomato with a lost look started wondering why she kept thinking about him. She was in love with Vikir but didn't want to admit it. She decided to leave the prayer for another day, turned her back on the statue and decided to calm down a bit, since after all, Vikir was just a good junior. She placed her hand on her chest and with a loving gaze, began thinking about the night hound and our boy. But these thoughts were interrupted when suddenly there was a noise. She turned to one side and with a confused look started wondering what was happening. Next to her there was a hallway. The wall broke into pieces and someone's body came flying towards her. Dolores began observing this silently, not knowing what was going on. This person was none other than Vikir. She looked with a bit of attention and saw that he was wearing the pandemic mask. Her gaze filled with confusion and surprise, leaving her speechless, realizing that he was the night hound. Using his feet, Vikir managed to stop his moving body, and once the smoke curtain began to disappear, Heave and Peto appeared. They started approaching him and prepared to attack again. Many questions came to Dolores' mind. She didn't know why the Night Bloodhound was here or why he was fighting against Quilty's guards. She placed one hand over her chest, extended the other towards him and called him by his name, Night Bloodhound. Upon hearing this, Vikir's body began to tremble and his gaze filled with fear. Quickly he started to turn around and upon seeing Saintess, his expression became confused as he didn't know what she was doing there. While he was distracted, Heave threw the scissors at his chest, causing them to pierce into his body without even giving him time to react. Vikir's body was thrown backward and crashed against the edge of the statue. Dolores turned around, and upon seeing this, her eyes filled with concern as she knew this wasn't good. The attack was so powerful that Vikir lay on the ground, and seeing this, Heave and Fido began to approach and decided to deliver the final blow. But Dolores wasn't going to let this happen. She stood in front of them, extended her hands to the sides, and with a look full of fear asked them to stop. Even though she didn't know what was happening, she was sure that if they talked it out they would reach an agreement. Her persuasion plan did not work against the demons. Both of them started staring at her, grabbed their swords tightly and prepared to take her out of the way. At first she was paralyzed with fear, but then she closed her eyes, clenched her teeth tightly and stood firm, ready to receive the attack. She didn't want to step aside and let Night Hound die. The demons attacked her and Vikir asked her to move aside. Using the Beelzebub sword he blocked Heave's attack. But unfortunately he didn't have another sword, so he blocked the other attack with his own arm, causing Fido's sword blade to sink into his arm. Despite having received so much damage, Vikir's gaze was firm. He began to look at the demons and remained silent. In a matter of seconds, the wound made by the sword caused him to start bleeding. The Saintess, who was behind him, opened one eye to see what was happening, and her gaze filled with fear and sadness upon seeing the wound on Vikir's arm. With a confident look, Vikir asked her not to worry about this. After saying this, he quickly began swinging his sword, breaking Heave's scissor blade into pieces. The demon started watching the fragments of the broken blade in the air, and his eyes filled with confusion. Just before Heave could understand the situation or make a move, Vikir stabbed the sword into his neck, not even giving him a chance to do anything about it. He drove the sword even harder into this bastard's neck to ensure he died, and seeing this, Fido pulled the sword from our boy's arm and prepared to deliver the final blow, thinking he was defenseless. Vikir swung the sword forcefully, cutting Heave's neck, and just before Fido could take advantage of this opportunity to attack, with a piercing gaze, Vikir turned around, swung the sword precisely, and also cut his neck, causing blood to fill the place. While the blood of the demons was falling to the ground, Dolores grabbed her shoulders, clenched her teeth tightly, and her gaze filled with fear. She couldn't believe that the Night Hound was so powerful. Vikir's suit was now covered in blood. Several seconds later, the heads of the demons fell next to their lifeless bodies. Vikir approached, began observing them, and remained silent. Dolores put her hand near her mouth and with a worried look remembered that he was injured. She approached him, clenched her fists, and with a look full of concern asked if he was okay, advising that it would be better to treat his arm right now. Vikir stood firm and told her not to worry about it. After saying this, he turned his head back and began to observe her with a serene gaze. He never would have thought he'd see the Saintess here, nor what she was doing here so late at night. With an expression full of terror, she started looking at the corpses. She didn't know why Quilty's guards had tried to attack her despite knowing who she really was. Vikir started pointing at the heads with his finger and asked her to pay attention. Fido's face began to slowly melt. Dolores put her hand over her mouth, and she couldn't help but feel disgusted. Vikir began to observe the head and revealed that they were undead who were using other people's faces. Dolores started looking at Fido's head, and with a trembling body, she asked why something like this was happening to people affiliated with the Quo Vadis family.